Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to first thank IDE and all the other sponsors of this event. I'd like to thank all of you for being here today. I'm going to be talking about the certain mega trends that are impacting economies globally. These could range from water scarcity to technological breakthroughs to urbanization and a shift in sort of global economic power. You might wonder, how does this really impact the hospitality industry? But as we go along, I think these are issues that will impact everybody on a global scale, regardless of which industry you work for. So the spillover effect of these trends, 5 trends in particular that I'll be talking about, are likely to impact the hospitality industry as well. And if you are part of the hospitality industry in the Middle East, somewhere, sometime in the future, this is definitely going to filter down to you. So it's a lot of introspection that I'd like you to sort of go through, consider these either opportunities or threats as we go along, but look within your industries and within your businesses and see how these could potentially impact you sometime in the future. So what are these 5 global mega trends? The first one is demographic and social change. This is basically talking about an explosive growth in population that we are expected to see in the near future. And we'll also talk about a rapidly aging population and what does that do to skilled manpower and professionals, as well as within its impact on the hospitality industry. Are you going to be impacted by this shift where a large percentage of the population as it exists today is going to be in their retirement stage, and how do you plan to arrange for skilled manpower to replace them? The second one is the shift in global economic power. There's a lot of talk that's already happened about this. We talk about the G7 and the E7 and how economic power is shifting from Europe and the Americas to the Asian economies, shifting eastwards. How does that impact the hospitality industry, the profile of travelers? And for you as hospitality professionals, be it from a standpoint of manpower to the profile of your guests and tourists that visit your countries, your properties, how do you need to sort of cope with this shift? We'll talk about rapid urbanization. Currently, there are approximately about 3 billion urban dwellers in the world. By the year 2030, this is expected to rise to 5 billion. There is also a huge increase in the population. We'll talk about that as we go along through the slides, where there is a rapid increase in sort of an explosive growth, really, in population growth. And how does that impact the resources that are available to us globally? We'll talk about resource scarcity. Water scarcity, we know, is an issue that is going to be a problematic one in the future. We'll also talk about energy resources, and we'll also talk about food. And then we'll come to how does this really impact hotels. And finally, we'll talk about technology, the impact or the explosive growth in the number of connected devices that are available globally. How is the transaction of economy moving towards a more sort of digital platform, online platform? And this has vast-reaching sort of impacts within the hospitality sphere. Specifically within the travel and tourism industry, the impacts of each one of these global trends. Let's start with demographic and social change. We have a shifting sort of dynamic or of profile of visitors who travel around the world. They used to be baby boomers. Most of them are not around anymore. So We have the new profile of people who were born in the 60s and the 70s. They're called silver tourists. Then we have the millennials who came in the 90s. And then you have the Gen Z who, basically are born after the 2000s. The way these people look at hospitality, the products, their travel patterns, as well as their demands of technology are at the two ends of the spectrum. How do you cope with that? We will talk about, again, as I said, technological breakthroughs from intermediaries to influencers, and how do they connect. Water scarcity is a key issue that is going to impact the Middle East in the coming years. We will talk about warmer summers and water scarcity in the Middle East. We will talk about the rise of the urban tourists, which relates to rapid urbanization, which is a global trend. And finally, with regards to the shift in global economic powers, we're going to talk about passing the torch from the advanced to the emerging economies, from the G7 to the E7. Let's look at the first megatrend. Complicated, yeah? Every time I do this, I have one shift here, one here, and one here. So please bear with me. Demographic and social change, the first megatrend. Now, if you will see, the diagram which is on top, the brown spaces are areas where population growth is actually a decline in population. There is less than 0% growth. Everywhere else, there is between 1% to 2+% growth. The ones that are shaded in brown, if you'll notice, are generally areas which are anyways not very populated in terms of density. But in any case, when we say there is 0% or less than 0% population growth, it is not because there is no, they're producing lesser babies than the rest of us, but essentially because there is a shift towards urbanization from these areas. So the key point that I wanted to bring out here is, if you look at the world and if you average out between 1 to 2% growth in population every year, and you look at a population globally of about 6 billion, we're adding on about 60 million people to the world's population every year. Is the planet really equipped to handle new population of 60 million plus every year? Secondly, and more importantly from an economic perspective, and think about the social impacts of this, do we create 60 million jobs a year? I don't think so. So what does this do to our economies, our people, and to us as a society when the number of people that are getting on board and we're looking out for jobs are actually far exceeding what we're developing? And the resulting sort of social impact of these. The second important aspect of aging, this demographic and social change, is that currently approximately about 8%, or should I say about 10% of the global population is over the age of 60. This is going to go up to 21%, more than double, by the year 2050. Once that happens, you're going to find that there is a certain vacuum that gets created in terms of skilled manpower. And are we doing enough to really cap that vacuum, make sure that there is enough training within industries to really create those jobs and make sure that this profile of employees and skilled professionals isn't going down. If you look at it specifically within the context of the hospitality industry, I wanted to bring in the profile of the travelers, from silver tourists to the millennials. There's two things I've just highlighted, and this is of consideration for you to sort of wonder about. One is shared economies, is something as a concept that has come up very recently. Most of us know shared economies as Airbnb. If you look at Gen Z, or let's go back to the silver tourists who are the aging lot, they're very wary of shared economies, going and staying in somebody's house. They're still the traditional types who would rather go and stay in a hotel. You have the millennials who prefer the shared economy format, and then you have the Gen Z who will, in the future, be highly dependent on this format of accommodation. On the other hand, if you look at digitization, you'll have the older lot, the silver tourists who value personalization, personalized service, they like their personal space, to millennials who prefer to be connected, to Gen Z who in future will be dependent upon this connectivity. As a tourism and hospitality industry, how do we respond to this change? You have the older generation of people who are at one end of the spectrum to the Gen Z who are at the total opposite end. So how do you deal with such diversity? There are 4 key things that I've listed here. The first one is to embrace innovation in hotel branding. Typically, hotels, we would slot hotels as 5-star, 4-star, 3-star. I think the shift as it goes forward, and particularly if you look at the younger lot of millennials as well as the Gen Z, they're not interested in 5 stars, 4 stars. They're more interested in experiential travel. So as you brand your hotels and you market your hotels, it becomes extremely important to move away from saying I'm a 5-star hotel or I'm a luxury hotel or I'm a 4-star or a budget hotel, to actually creating an experience, because experiential travel is something that is going to impact the world in the coming future. Also, localization of products is going to be very important, because the younger lot, as they go out from one country to another, they want to have different experiences. That is the purpose of that travel. And if you give them a cookie-cutter product, a similar hotel room in every single place that they travel, it's not something that is going to particularly interest these. They have a short sort of memory, they want to experience different things. If you give them the same product, you could be out of their favor very soon. So experiential travel and sort of localized branding is something that is going to play very importantly going into the future. Proactive versus a reactive approach to shared economies. I was talking to, interestingly, to the CEO of a 3-star sort of branded hotel company, and how he sees the Airbnb concept impacting his business. And the first thing he said was, no, it doesn't impact me at all. This is not the profile of people that come to my hotels. I found that to be very surprising, because the 3-star budget hotel is, in my opinion, the one that is going to be maximum impacted by Airbnbs. That is typically the profile of people that would choose to stay here versus go to an apartment. Now, I think hotels have been very slow and in sort of responding to, if I may call it a disruptor. I was corrected once by a very learned person. He said, why do you call it a disruptor? It is actually an enhancement of the industry. So you look at it in a positive way rather than a disruptive way, which I thought was a very good way of looking at it. But if I still may go with disruptor, I think hotels have been very slow to responding to this new challenge that is being presented by Airbnbs. I think you need to take a more proactive approach in terms of dealing with Airbnb, being a part of them, embracing them so that they become a part of that industry rather than trying to grab market share out of each other. How do you work with each other as opposed to fighting each other? Overhauling of the traditional hotel marketing concepts. Over time, by and large, marketing concepts, how do you reach out to the people, have been quite traditional, be it through print media, be it through travel agents or TV or tour operators, and effectively that is being used. You all know how digitization has changed in the past 20 years, how social media has come up in the past 20 years, and how have hotels responded to this changing environment. How do you maximize or optimize your marketing to take advantage of this huge shift in social media, in the emergence of new methods where you can actually sort of market your products? Finally, digitization and hyper-personalization. I told you there is the older lot that values personalized services versus the younger generation who are very, very dependent on connectivity. There is one lot of people like myself, somewhat older, who still prefer to have somebody to talk to, walk in and check in at reception, have some kind of service, room service and things like that, versus others who, who would want to check in on their mobile and who would want to check out on their mobile, and all through their entire hotel experience may not want to interact with anybody. That's the younger lot. And that is a challenge that you'll have to face, because your product is one, but the profile of your customers is at two ends. The next mega trend that I want to talk about is shift in global economic powers. This is an interesting chart. Now, we've all known the G7, if I may name them. That's the US, Japan, Germany, UK, France, Italy, and Canada. Traditionally, the global centers of economic power. There is an emerging lot of economies called the E7, the emerging seven, which are now China, India, Brazil, Russia, Indonesia, Mexico, and Turkey. Now, interestingly, if you look at the two charts, which is 2009, I'm sorry, it's not very visible, so I'm going to read it out to you. If you look at the GDP in trillions in 2009, the G7 were at 29 trillion, the E7 were at 20 trillion. So 29 versus 20. If you look at 2050, the G7 would have grown from 29 to 69 trillion, whereas the E7 would have grown from 20 to 138 trillion. That is the power of the E7 as they're emerging today. And they're heavily, heavily impacting the hospitality and travel industry as well. The chart on top shows you, if you look at all the economies of the world, and if you try and sort of looking at their GDP, try and create a center of the world, where does that economic center lie? In 1965, you will see it was more a little north, upwards. It rests in Africa. That does not mean Africa was the center of the world, but that was the pull that the European economies and the American economies had on global trade and global economics. By 2050, you can clearly see it's moving downwards and it's moving to the east. That is the impact of India and China by 2050. How does that impact the GCC? Interestingly, in this entire shift of global trade that is happening, we in the GCC are very well positioned because we are right at the center of it. This trade that moves up and down the two regions of the world, we are well positioned within the center to actually take advantage of this in either way that the trade moves. The second important thing is that the GCC sovereign wealth funds can actually play a huge role, and actually are playing a huge role in global economics and trade. I think if a lot of that investment that they're making globally, which of course is very nice, were also sort of centralized and more homeward bound, then it is likely that we could sort of benefit further from the shift. How does this impact the hospitality and travel and tourism industries? The chart, which is on the top left, basically shows a movement of travelers. If you'll see from the 1980s clearly, and this is basically international tourist arrivals into a destination. If you look from the 1980s, you will see that it is obviously very sort of advanced economies focused. And gradually, as we speak now, this is a very interesting time because this is where the East and the West meet. And the shift of power happens now. That's the point. Where international travel to the emerging economies towards the East is actually taking over travel to the West. Interestingly, the number of travelers that are coming out of these emerging companies are also overtaking Western travelers. So it's a very interesting phenomena where there is more amount of travel to the East than the West, and there is more amount of travel from the East to the West, comparatively. The three diagrams that you see there, the rounds at the bottom, basically show international tourist arrivals. 64%, I'm sorry, once again, it's not very clear, so I'm going to read it out to you. If you look at 1980, 64% of travelers inbound were to Europe and 22% were to the United States. Only 8% was to the East. In 2010, it's down to 51% and 16% for the West, up to 22% for Asia and the Pacific. In 2030, from 64%, Europe will be down to 41. The Americas will be down from 22 to 14, whereas Asia would have grown from 8% to 22% and finally up to 30%. As hoteliers, we need to respond to this shift. You're going to have more number of Chinese coming in, and they'll have a totally separate set of demands than originally what the Western travelers used to be. There will be other Indians coming in, and their demands will be totally different from what your Western travelers used to be. As a product and as a service offering that you provide to the global traveler, how do you respond to this shift in demand? Are you actually even thinking about it, quite frankly? I mean, if I ask hotel companies, are you even thinking about these things? Are you still going with your cookie cutter hotels? This is my standardized hotel room. I provide one coffee shop, maybe a bar, and one Italian restaurant. Does that work in the future? You really need to seriously consider. The next global megatrend that I want to talk about is rapid urbanization. Now, I threw out some numbers, 3 billion urban dwellers going up to 5 billion by 2030. Currently, about 50% of the world's population is urbanized. By 2025, there'll be a need for another 40 mega cities. Our population, which is maybe 6.5 billion, will be well over 8.5 billion. About 1.5 million people get added on as urban dwellers every week across the world. In the Middle East, we already actually have a highly urbanized population. About 85% of the Middle East population is urbanized. That, of course, leads to a huge demand for infrastructure projects, which is, of course, as you all know, the need of cities. About $4 trillion worth of projects that are currently underway. But having said that, if you specifically look at the Middle East, what does this do to the region and what it has done? There's, of course, like I told you, there's a huge amount of infrastructure projects, airlines, product offerings, be it from retail to, leisure and entertainment to fancy buildings, education and things like that. Everything is, of course, moved in pace. The key thing that I wanted to bring out here, yes, it's good, maybe that there is this trend towards urbanization. The world is moving towards urbanization. As a region, we are already at 85%, so probably ahead of the world. But what I want to talk about in this regard was sustainability. How sustainable is this urbanization today and going out into the future? Or are we just eating into resources without giving a thought for what is the impact of it? It becomes our social responsibility going forward for our children and their children that this urbanization is done in a responsible and sustained manner. Climate change is one of the impacts of this urbanization, this rapid urbanization, this unplanned urbanization, if I may call it. And we all see what is the impact of it. We've all been talking about it. Specifically, coming to Megatrend 4, sorry, missed that one, is again leading from urbanization. We talk about climate change and resource scarcity. Now, with a population of about, like I say, 8.3 billion by 2030, here are some interesting numbers. We'll need 50% more energy, 40% more water than what we have today, and 35% more food. there is growth on one side, urbanization on one side, and sustainability on the other side. Clearly, the two are at odds. And it is our job to try and make this meet. You look at the slide which is below, and it talks about projected water scarcity in 2025. Most of the areas, starting from the brown, I'll just read it out to you, pretty much entirely the entire world, barring, certain areas which are marked in gray, effectively will have issues with water scarcity. In the GCC, we do about 80% of our drinking water, potable water supply is through desalination, yet we have only about 178 megawatts of installed capacity in the region from renewable energy, which is less than 1% of Germany. So this is something as a region that we need to think about. How do we make ourselves more sustainable in the future once these crisis hits? I would like you to sort of take notice of the next slide. It talks about the impact of resource scarcity in different parts of the world, which is very interesting. For the Middle East region, it is warmer summers and water scarcity. I know you can't see a lot of that or read, but I'm going to read it out for you. I just want to say, the degree of intensity with which it will impact different parts of the world basically shows as the orange bar increases. So the more orange, the higher the impact, the less orange, the lower the impact. So if you look at North America, for instance, it tells you how will it be impacted. There will be water scarcity, warmer winters, there will be increase in extreme events, land biodiversity loss, there will be a rise in sea levels. Yet the impact of it, although through multiple fronts, the impact of it is not very severe because they've already been working towards managing these things for the future. If you look at the Middle East, there are two issues. There is water scarcity and warmer summers. Not as diverse an impact as you would say the Americas, but see the intensity of the impact for water scarcity and warmer summers. It is a huge impact. How do we sort of look at these things, and how do we manage this going out into the future? How do we control and mitigate these changes? Of course, technology, there's a sustainability roadmap. You can talk about education awareness, disaster management, regulatory framework, and sort of involvement. These are all sort of very technical and process-driven things. But I think a lot of this change can actually come from within us, where we actually start to recognize the importance and the impact of these changes. And then, of course, everything, the adaptation strategies can fall in place. Finally, I want to talk about technological breakthroughs. We said this is a huge shift in the way business gets done. Very interestingly, if you look at 2003, I'm going to read this out for you again. The world population was about 6.3 billion. The connected devices were about 500 million. So 0.08 devices per person. In the year 2020, the population will increase to 7.6 billion. The number of connected devices will be 50 billion. And the number of devices per person, like I said, will go up from 0.08 to 6.58. Now, this is a huge opportunity for us as an industry and for economies as such to really take advantage of and try and push our business in the right direction. The hospitality business, typically, I think, where opportunities get created, there's 5 stages. There's an influence, there's book, there's prepare, there's stay, and there's feedback. And I think technology impacts every single phase of this customer journey, all the way from influencing his decision of where to travel, where to book, how do you prepare, what are the things you do, where do you stay, and finally how you give feedback. And I think this is where we say, where you create experiences along this entire journey to actually create a sort of a seamless sort of an experience for your travelers, as against look at each one individually. That effectively brings me to the end of my presentation. I know it was very boring. I'm sorry, I think I may have sort of overstepped my time. I really don't have much time for any time, rather, for questions. But I'll be hosting a panel right now. We have about 40 minutes there, so I'll leave some time for Q&A there. If you have any questions about this, please feel sure. Please go ahead.
Hello. Hi.
Hello.
It was an amazing presentation.
Thank you.
In hospitality industry, we always talk about see, feel, and engage, right? And all these changes that are happening over the course of time, like bringing about these global changes in urbanism and all that. Where do we see that all these informations of digitization, change in technology, will accommodate all these, the so-called themes of see, feel, engage?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last bit of it. Can you say that again?
So all these like upgrade or let's say new technologies that are coming again, how do we bring that into the concept of see, feel, and engage?
Yeah, it's very interesting. So this thing of see, feel, and engage, like I said, can be very different for you than it can be for me. I may consider myself a silver tourist, so the experience that I intend to get out of this see, feel, engage, and whether you're using technology or whatever medium to give me that personalized experience, could be very different from you, who may be a millennial or a Gen Z and are looking for a lot of gizmos in the room, for example. Yeah, it's hard to sort of give one clear set of guidelines to say this is what you need to do in order to capture everybody. I think there'll be within so let me rephrase it this way. I talked about experiential travel. I think a lot of the technology and the things that you do with regards to see, feel, and your experience is really creating that experiential travel. But of course, it'll be very different from a silver tourist to a millennial. Not a whole lot different from a millennial to a Gen Z. But this is something that needs to be considered, carefully thought out.
Thank you.
Vikram, one question. First of all, the presentation was not boring at all.
That's very interesting because the first time I'm hearing somebody saying that it was a good presentation. Yeah? I've made this several times before. People have just fallen short of throwing slippers at me. But thank you very much. You're very, very kind people.
It was a very interesting presentation. I actually have a laundry list of questions.
Okay.
But in the interest of time.
Can I ask another question?
Certainly. Yes, please. Go ahead.
Hello. I think your presentation is very interesting.
Thank you.
I'm one of the young generation you're talking about, and I feel what you're talking about, the experience and the social media is very true. Do you see such as Airbnb, this kind of mode, as a threat for hotels?
Very interesting, ma'am. So, a lot of hoteliers, I think, still are coming around to the concept of B&B, which is very interesting because they are not even being reactive to it at this stage. Forget about being proactive, how to handle this. I was making a presentation, and specifically on shared economies some time ago, and I was going through some data, and very interestingly, I found that I think something between 2008 to 2015 or 16, Airbnbs had catered to about 40 million travels in something like 180 or 190 countries, some thousands of destinations or cities and things like that. So you look at the rapid rise of Airbnb coming from 2008 or so onwards up until now, 40 million visits across 190 countries, God knows how many cities. It's all, like I was saying about shared economies, I think I was reading somewhere about the valuation of different companies that form part of these shared economies. So there was something about the valuation of Airbnb being more than, I think, the top 3 or 4 hotel companies in the world combined. the valuation of, I think, Uber being more than some of these large airlines in the world. So it's, this concept of shared economy is catching on really fast. I think, the hotel industry is still looking upon it as a, as a passing disruptor, that'll come and go, and I don't think they've really figured out a strategy of how to deal with them. But more importantly, like I said, rather than look upon it, as somebody told me once, rather than look upon it as a disruptor, it probably makes more sense to look upon them as a partner. You partner with an emerging trend like Airbnb to promote your business, rather than trying to fight it. I'll give you a clear example. If you look at what was happening in the 90s when these OTAs came up, these online, the booking.coms and Expedias of the world, where, hotel companies typically tried to fight them first, realized that they cannot do with them, and actually ended up partnering with them. Now, it's still a love-hate relationship for the past 20 years. They still hate these OTAs, but they know that they cannot live without them, or the platforms that they offer for reservations to customers. So I think the sooner the hospitality industry understands that Airbnbs and other products like them are here to stay, probably do their business a lot good in the future.
But on that
Sorry,
note,
long answer, yeah?
On that note, Vikram, who in the hospitality industry is the one that needs to make that initiative? Because even if you look at this brochure, which everybody has got, a lot of our partners are looking to connect with let's say, developers, and then you have operators. A lot of partners are looking to connect with the operators. Because nowadays the trend is the owner will own the land, and the operator is the one who does the marketing, the branding, and reaching out to people. So, and then of course the architect will come and do their bit. Who is that one person that needs to make that initiative and reach out to the Airbnbs of the world?
Airbnb is just a platform. It's an online platform. Anybody can go and sort of register your product, of course, within certain government guidelines and governing laws of your country. You can go, put your product up there, and you can actually start receiving, guests and making money out of it, yeah? So it's, yes, we could say that Airbnb could actually make this platform more accessible to hotel companies to actually list their rooms. The point is, would hotel companies want to go and list their rooms into Airbnb? Are there any other ways that you can partner, not just with Airbnb, but with other shared economies? So for example, would a hotel company want to partner with an Uber to enhance the product offering that they give to their customers? It's hard to say, I would imagine it's beneficial if this tie-up happens proactively from both sides. I just can't say who needs to make the first step. Maybe both do, quite frankly.